Mysteries of the past surround us, yet in the hustle of daily life, we rarely pay them any attention. Countless incredible events that defined the course of history often remain hidden behind a thick veil of secrecy or deliberate distortion. However, the truth has a habit of surfacing, even centuries later. The official version of human history offers us a neat, linear picture of civilization's development. But one only needs to look a little closer, casting aside familiar dogmas, for deep cracks to appear in this unshakable foundation. We are accustomed to accepting what is written in school textbooks on faith, and we rarely ask uncomfortable questions while walking past majestic architectural monuments that silently guard their secrets. Many people simply do not think about the nature of what they see every day. We walk through the historic centers of old cities, our eyes gliding over giant granite columns, perfect seamless masonry, and complex engineering solutions, without even trying to compare what we see with the level of development historians insistently ascribe to that era. We are told that these architectural masterpieces were created in an age when the main transport was a horse and cart, lighting was provided by candles, and the main construction tools remained a primitive chisel, a hammer, and the brute force of thousands of workers. But looking at monolithic embankments and antique porticos, a persistent sense of cognitive dissonance arises. Was it really possible to build all this with only primitive technology? The technical complexity of execution and the processing of hard rock clearly contradict the official picture of the world, where industry was supposedly in its infancy. The scale of the structures makes one doubt they were erected by people wearing bast shoes, whose greatest dream was a warm stove. This gap between the material evidence of the era and the description of everyday life at that time is the first alarm bell indicating that we know far too little about our real past. Today, we will try to get to the bottom of a unique historical anomaly, facts about which continue to surface even now. We are talking about an amazing phenomenon documented in the mid-19th century. Archival materials from that time demonstrate something that defies simple and rational explanation from the point of view of classical history. Huge, fully built, majestic cities standing absolutely empty. This is not just a lack of idle crowds on the streets. It is the total, ringing silence of megalopolises. Buildings look abandoned, dilapidated in places. There is not a soul on the wide avenues, and the usual city bustle seems to have been erased by someone's invisible hand. Moreover, vegetation in these stone jungles is practically absent, as if the urban landscape had just been created on scorched earth, or conversely, carefully scrutinized and cleared of all life. At first, this fact may seem insignificant, but upon detailed examination of city panoramas of that period, for example, Moscow or St. Petersburg, the oddities begin to accumulate like a snowball. The cities do not just look uninhabited, they look dead or mothballed. Before diving into the details, it is worth realizing the scale of this strangeness. We are used to thinking that progress moved smoothly, from simple to complex, step by step. But before we knew it, in the last few decades, our world has changed beyond recognition. Technology has made a giant leap, which we consider natural. However, if we look into the slightly deeper past, the logic of sequential development begins to crumble. The more we analyze the evidence of that era, the less we understand what technologies our ancestors actually possessed, and what exactly happened to make them disappear from the streets of their own cities. If the architecture itself, incomparable with the official level of development of the 19th century, raises many questions, then the technical details noticeable upon careful study are even more baffling. After all, if buildings can survive for centuries, technologies tend to change faster. And here another paradox awaits us. If we believe the textbooks, then those times were the era of horse traction. But a careful study of the chronicles reveals details that completely contradict this version. If the architecture seems too complex for that time, then the transport technologies captured in these empty cities look downright impossible. Standard historical chronology asserts that the development of urban transport followed a clear and logical path. First came horse traction, then steam engines, and only then did humanity master electricity. We are told about the first horse-drawn trams, where animals struggled to pull heavy cars along rails. This fits into a worldview where electricity had not yet become a widespread blessing. However, upon detailed study of archives from the second half of the 19th century, a researcher encounters striking examples that completely break this neat scheme and cast doubt on the reliability of the official version of technical progress. Documentary evidence of that era clearly shows trams moving as if on their own. They have no team of horses, no smoking steam boilers, and no familiar overhead wires stretching to a contact network. A logical question arises. By what force does this multi-ton composition move? This looks like technology ahead of its time, or, more likely, evidence of a lost civilization that possessed different principles of working with energy. If we turn to reference data, officially, the world's first electric railway opened in Berlin only on May 31, 1879. The locomotive's electric motor received energy through a contact rail, and the track was only about 300 meters long. It was an experimental attraction, far from a full-fledged urban transport network. But the mysterious trams in the archival footage look not like an experiment, but like part of a smooth-running, everyday system. The first thing that comes to the mind of a modern engineer is power through the rails. But this requires bulky transformer substations and complex safety systems, traces of which are not observed on the streets of ancient cities. Another version is battery power. However, in the 19th century, power sources were far from perfect. If such cars ran on batteries of that time, they would have had to drag a separate trailer with huge containers that would require charging for a full day. This would inevitably affect the design. The cars would become heavy and clumsy. But we see light, elegant structures on wheels, unburdened by anything, freely cruising the streets. The most amazing thing happens further along the timeline. An inexplicable gap occurs in history, and the era of horse-drawn trams arrives. An absurd picture of evolution in reverse emerges. First, transport drove independently using clean energy unknown to us. And then, people suddenly invented a more primitive way, harnessing horses to wagons. It is hard to imagine a civilization voluntarily giving up convenient technology in favor of outdated and dirty methods, unless a global catastrophe occurred that threw development back and forced people to forget the principles of old mechanisms. The horse tram replacing electric traction looks not like progress, but like a forced measure of survivors trying to use the remnants of past infrastructure, the meaning of which they no longer understand. Indirect confirmation of the existence of other technologies is provided by strange poles captured in city centers, for example, in St. Petersburg. These structures bear little resemblance to familiar lampposts or power line supports. They look like complex technical devices, possibly elements of wireless energy transmission or atmospheric electricity, the operating principle of which is now lost. Over time, these mysterious artifacts disappeared from the streets, giving way to primitive wires and kerosene lamps, and then to the trams with overhead lines we are used to. However, if the level of technology was so high that it allowed for the creation of autonomous transport and, probably, the use of free energy, then where did the creators of this splendor go? Technical perfection implies the presence of a developed society, engineers, workers, and passengers. But in the documentary footage capturing these amazing mechanisms, a frightening, unnatural silence reigns. The machinery is there, the rails are laid, majestic buildings stand, but around them, not a soul. Cities that seemingly possess the technologies of the future look completely depopulated. This leads us to an even darker mystery. What could have forced the population of entire megalopolises to vanish, leaving their homes and machines fully intact. When diving into the study of archival materials from the mid-19th century, a researcher inevitably encounters a phenomenon that causes not just bewilderment, but a genuine shiver down the spine. This is the phenomenon of empty cities. If we cast aside a superficial glance and conduct a detailed visual analysis of panoramic shots of Moscow and St. Petersburg from that period, a picture reveals itself that is completely uncharacteristic of bustling imperial capitals. The main and most obvious anomaly striking the eye in hundreds of photographs from various sources is the total absence of people. Streets that logically should be bursting with life appear before us absolutely deserted. This is not just a quiet hour of siesta or an early weekend morning. This is a vacuum. Huge avenues, monumental squares, and embankments look as if the entire population suddenly evaporated, leaving the urban infrastructure completely intact. The grandeur of the architecture against this background only amplifies the oppressive feeling of abandonment. The city turns into a giant, skillfully executed stage set, where the actors have not yet walked on stage, or worse, have left it forever. This is especially evident in the absence of the so-called household noise of life. In any inhabited city of the 19th century, where heating was done by stoves and industry ran on coal and wood, smoke should invariably be curling over the roofs. Hundreds of thousands of chimneys should be spewing combustion products into the sky. After all, people need to cook food, heat water, and heat huge stone houses in a harsh climate. However, in the panoramas, the sky is crystal clear, and the chimneys look like decorative elements. There is not the slightest hint of working stoves, boiler rooms, or factories. The city seems powered down and deprived of its thermal heart. If you peer into the residential quarters, the strangeness continues. Windows are the eyes of a house, and they can tell a lot about its inhabitants. But here, we see shutters closed tight, or dark voids of glass. Familiar elements of everyday life, such as curtains, drapes, or flowers in pots on windowsills, are missing. Nowhere is there laundry drying on ropes in courtyards or on balconies, an unchanging attribute of city life of that era. There is no clothes hung out for airing, no carpets being beaten on the street. Everything looks sterile and uninhabited. The streets are also devoid of the usual participants in traffic. Where are the numerous cab drivers waiting for passengers? Where are the carts with goods, the coachmen, the water carriers? Where are the street vendors, newspaper boys, police officers? Animals are completely absent. There are no stray dogs, no cats, no horses, not even birds in the squares. In Moscow, which was historically famous for its merchant scope, on panoramic shots of huge trading rows, one can find at most 3 or 4 signs. Hundreds of shops, banks, and institutions stand without identification marks. A persistent impression is created that the city was either just built and awaits settlement, or it was hastily abandoned, and all traces of life were removed. Sometimes there are buildings that lack roofs, which further reinforces the feeling of incompleteness or abandonment. These are not ruins in the usual sense, but rather structures that were either not finished or suffered from some impact, but there is no one to restore them. All these details form an image of a dead space frozen in time. Of course, as soon as such facts become a subject of discussion, skeptics instantly put forward the most popular and, seemingly, indestructible argument. They claim that there is no mystery here, and the emptiness of the streets is explained by the technical imperfection of early photography. They refer to the notorious long exposure time, due to which moving objects allegedly simply did not have time to be imprinted on the photographic plate and vanished, turning into invisible ghosts. It sounds logical and scientific, but let's try to destroy this myth with facts that lie on the surface and are available to any observant person. The argument about the technical imperfection of 19th century photographic equipment is the most common shield used by official science to cover up uncomfortable questions. We are persistently told that the first daguerreotypes required colossal exposure times, from 10 to 30 minutes. According to this theory, any moving object, a person, a carriage, or a dog, simply did not have time to register on the light-sensitive plate and disappeared, turning into an invisible ghost. However, this argument crumbles to dust upon the first encounter with the real chronology of the development of photography and a comparative analysis of images from the same period. If we turn to historical facts, by the mid-19th century, technology had stepped far forward. Shutter speeds had been reduced to seconds, allowing for the capture of dynamic scenes. The clearest proof of the failure of the disappearance theory is the famous photograph of Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, taken in 1861. In this shot, a crowd of thousands is clearly visible. Yes, some faces are blurred, figures in motion have lost sharpness, but they are there. They did not dissolve into the air. They fill the space before the Capitol in a dense mass. Why then, in photos of St. Petersburg or Moscow dated to the same years, do we see absolute emptiness? Did Russian photographers use century-old technology while the whole world was already shooting reportage? This is extremely unlikely, given the close cultural and scientific ties of that time. Moreover, the physics of the photographic process is such that a moving object with a long exposure leaves behind a trail or a semi-transparent blurred spot. But on the mysterious panoramas of cities, there are no ghostly silhouettes or misty traces of movement. The pavements are clean and deserted. Every cobblestone is drawn with perfect clarity, which would be impossible if pedestrians and transport were moving along the street in a continuous stream. The skeptic's second line of defense is the time of shooting. It is claimed that photographers specifically went out hunting early in the morning, at dawn, when the city was still sleeping, so that no one would interfere with the work. But here too, simple geometric analysis comes to the rescue. It is enough to look at the shadows cast by buildings, columns, and rare objects. In most empty shots, the shadows are short and dense, which clearly indicates the position of the sun close to the zenith. This is noon, or around noon, the very height of the working day. To imagine the capital of a huge empire completely dying out at noon is impossible. Even on weekends and holidays, squares should be filled with people going to temples or for walks. But they are not there. Another inexplicable mystery remains the angle from which many panoramic shots were taken. Photos of Palace Square and the Alexander Column often look as if they were taken from a bird's-eye view. The shooting point is high in the air, but not attached to any high building or bell tower existing in reality. At that time, there were no quadcopters or airplanes. Aerostats and hot air balloons existed, but were bulky, unstable, and expensive to operate. Taking a perfectly clear, leveled shot with a heavy camera on glass plates from the swaying basket of a hot air balloon is a technically almost impossible task. Who went up into the sky, and how, to capture the dead city from a perfect vantage point? This suggests observation technologies that do not fit into the official picture of the 19th century. Thus, we come to a logical conclusion. If people were not erased by long exposure and were not sleeping in their homes at the height of a sunny day, then they were really not there. The streets were physically empty. But along with the inhabitants, something else disappeared from the cities. Something no less important for life. If you look closely at the landscapes, you can notice a strange feature concerning nature itself around these stone giants. The absence of people is only half the trouble. A much more disturbing fact is what happened to the vegetation. Another crucial, yet often ignored witness to the real events of the past is nature. Vegetation, or rather its absence or anomalous youth, serves as a biological marker that cannot be faked. If we distract ourselves from architectural forms and pay attention to the landscape of ancient cities of the mid-19th century, a striking detail reveals itself. In megalopolises whose history allegedly spans centuries, century-old trees are practically absent. This contradicts all logic of the natural development of an urban environment. After all, any old city is not only stone, but also parks, alleys, and gardens that should grow along with the streets. However, on archival panoramas, we see a completely different, sterile picture. Instead of spreading oaks, century-old lindens, or powerful poplars that should have been casting shade on wide avenues, vast, naked spaces or rare, stunted shrubs appear before our eyes. At best, thin saplings are planted along the roads, the age of which clearly does not exceed 3 to 5 years. This observation is true for both Moscow and St. Petersburg, as well as for many other cities around the world captured in that era. One gets the impression that the entire biosphere was destroyed to the root, or these cities were erected on completely lifeless, dead soil, where a fertile layer had not yet had time to form. The example of Irkutsk is particularly illustrative, where a chronology of images has been preserved, allowing us to trace the dynamics of change. In the earliest photographs, dating back to the 1850s, the city appears as a stone skeleton in the middle of a desert. No people, no trees, only lonely buildings on bare ground. A decade later, the situation begins to change. The first, still very weak sprouts, young pines, and shrubs appear. Vegetation begins to timidly seize space, as if nature is recovering from some global cataclysm that wiped all flora off the face of the earth. And only decades later do the amount of greenery and its size come into line with what we are used to considering normal. This phenomenon of young forests in old cities suggests that the territories were subjected to a total cleanup. It is hard to imagine that city mayors or architects mass-logged all adult trees for a whim, leaving the streets under the scorching sun without a single source of shade. A more likely scenario seems to be one in which cities were either excavated from under a layer of soil brought by some catastrophe, or restored after an event that destroyed all life. St. Isaac's Cathedral, standing in the middle of a field devoid of even grass, looks in this context not like a monument to the triumph of art, but like a surviving artifact at a disaster site. The landscape looks as if it had just been created in a computer editor from scratch. Buildings are placed, textures are applied, but natural objects have not yet been added. The soil looks compacted, unnaturally smooth and empty. This tabula rasa, clean slate, state evokes a disturbing feeling. The city exists, the infrastructure is ready, but there is no life in the biological sense of the word in it yet. Over time, changes begin to occur on these lifeless streets. Nature takes its toll. Grass breaks through the cobblestones. Planted alleys begin to gain strength. And it is at this moment, when the decorations are already slightly inhabited by vegetation, that the main actors enter the stage. Into the empty, echoing blocks, where only the wind recently walked, the first people begin to penetrate. However, their appearance raises even more questions than their absence. Looking at these new inhabitants, it is hard to get rid of the thought that they are strangers here. Who are they? The legitimate heirs of a great empire of builders? Or simply random survivors who came to the ruins of a highly developed civilization? Toward the end of the 19th century, the frozen picture of silence begins to change. Movement appears in archival documents recording the state of city streets, but this settlement process raises no fewer questions than the emptiness preceding it. If previously we observed sterile stage sets, now actors enter the frame, but their role on this gigantic stage seems tragically inconsistent with the scale of the surrounding space. The appearance of people in these stone jungles looks not like a triumphant return of the masters, but like the timid intrusion of strangers into a territory whose true purpose is perhaps not fully clear to them. The contrast between the grandeur of architectural forms and the appearance of the new inhabitants is simply colossal. We see giant temples with columns reaching into the sky, monumental palaces with doorways designed as if for giants, and the perfect geometry of granite embankments. And against the background of this imperial splendor, small, poorly dressed figures appear. People look confused and alien. Their clothes are simple, often untidy. Their transport consists of primitive wooden carts and wagons that seem like ridiculous toys next to the engineering masterpieces of bridges and aqueducts. There is a persistent feeling that these people did not build the buildings surrounding them, but simply came to everything ready-made, occupying the vacant ruins of a highly developed civilization. The atmosphere reigning in the photos of that period is saturated with the spirit of a post-apocalypse. The few passers-by wander among empty blocks as if looking for shelter or useful resources. There is no feeling of orderly city life, no dense traffic. It resembles scenes from disaster movies where a handful of survivors try to establish life in a world left from vanished humanity. Groups of people are small. They stick together as if afraid of the huge empty space around them. The state of some iconic structures during this transition period is particularly telling. For example, in a number of images, St. Isaac's Cathedral, this masterpiece of engineering thought, appears in a strange form. Its foot is densely overgrown with wild grass and weeds. This is an absurd detail for the main operating temple of the empire. If these people had really just erected such a wonder of the world, they would be blowing dust particles off it and refining the territory. But the rampant vegetation breaking through the joints of the stones speaks of a lack of proper care and, possibly, a long period of desolation. The new residents simply cannot cope with maintaining the legacy inherited by them, or it does not have the sacred value for them that official history ascribes to it. The dynamics of settlement are also very curious. One can trace how population density changed over the decades. First, complete emptiness and silence. Then, solitary silhouettes looking like scouts. A little later, small groups appear. Spontaneous markets arise. Life begins to glimmer on the ruins. And only after a considerable time, closer to the beginning of the 20th century, streets like Nevsky Prospect fill with familiar crowds. The city comes to life, but this revival looks secondary. It is as if ants were released into a huge, complex mechanism that had been turned off for a long time, and they began to inhabit its gears, not understanding the principle of the entire machine's operation. This gradual wave-like settlement suggests a planned migration or resettlement program to vacated territories. The cities stood ready, waiting for new tenants. Infrastructure designed for millions received first hundreds, then thousands, until the demographic capacity was filled. But the very idea that one can come to a ready-made, empty megalopolis and simply start living in it seems fantastic and impossible from the point of view of the logic of social development we are used to. However, before dismissing this version as fiction, it is worth looking around. After all, such a scenario is not a unique phenomenon of the distant past. It has frightening parallels in our modern reality. The seemingly fantastic picture where people come to already finished but absolutely empty megalopolises ceases to be so if we look at the processes taking place in the modern world. History tends to repeat itself, and sometimes the answers to the riddles of the past lie not in dusty archives, but in today's news reports. In our time, there is a clearly documented phenomenon of so-called ghost cities, which helps shed light on the mysterious events of the 19th century. This phenomenon is most clearly manifested in economically developed countries, particularly in China, where grandiose construction projects are being implemented that outstrip demographic needs by decades. Modern corporations and states erect entire districts and even new cities for growth. Huge residential arrays, wide highways, parks, shopping centers, and administrative buildings stand fully ready for operation. They have everything, from benches in squares to complex engineering communications. The only thing they lack is people. Kilometers of empty windows look out onto deserted avenues, creating a surreal feeling of frozen time. This is done systematically, with an eye on the future mass resettlement of rural residents or the relief of overcrowded centers. If we photograph such a city today, we will get shots frighteningly similar to those mysterious panoramas of Moscow or St. Petersburg a century and a half ago. The grandeur of stone and concrete with a complete absence of biological life. This parallel allows us to put forward a bold and, perhaps, the only logical hypothesis explaining all the accumulated inconsistencies. It is likely that the cities of the 19th century were not built by the people shown to us in photographs, in simple peasant clothes and bast shoes. These monumental structures, antique columns, granite embankments, and complex underground communications were already ready-made infrastructure. It was either carefully restored or created anew by an unknown, highly developed force that prepared a bridgehead for the settlement of a new civilization. This approach instantly removes the contradiction between the primitiveness of the official technologies of that time and the complexity of the architectural heritage. It becomes clear why there is no smoke from chimneys and no laundry on ropes in the early shots. The city simply had not yet been commissioned. This also explains the absence of old trees. The landscape was formed anew after some global event or catastrophe that required a complete reboot of the territory. The people we see in later shots are not builders, but the first settlers, new tenants who received the keys to apartments they did not design or erect. That is precisely why we observe a strange degradation of technologies, when instead of effective fuel-free transport, horse-drawn trams suddenly appear. The new inhabitants simply did not possess the knowledge to maintain the complex equipment inherited by them. They used what they could understand, adapting the great legacy to their primitive needs. It resembles a kind of cargo cult, using form without understanding content. Majestic palaces turned into communal apartments, complex atmospheric installations into stands for kerosene lamps, and perfectly level avenues filled with horse manure. Thus, a picture of a global historical process emerges before us, which was hidden behind the pages of edited textbooks. We are used to being proud of what our ancestors built, but the facts inexorably indicate that we are, perhaps, merely lodgers in someone else's house. We live within walls whose construction technologies still cause disputes among engineers. We walk along streets whose layout strikes with its mathematical precision. We use the remnants of infrastructure, the true purpose of which was possibly completely different. This entire array of data, from strange trams and empty streets to young vegetation and confused people against the backdrop of cyclopean ruins, comes together into a single puzzle. This is the story of how one civilization replaced another, taking its place on a finished foundation. And looking today at the spires of ancient cathedrals or descending into the granite depths of the subway, it is worth asking yourself one simple but bone-chilling question. Whose legacy are we actually occupying? And where did the true masters of this stone world vanish?